podcast. Now, this particular podcast will be a historical episode. That means this is about a person, place, or thing that has an important influence on metal, and an important influence it is. Today's episode is going to be a historical account of the reign of terror brought upon Essex County, England, not New Jersey, England, of Matthew Hopkins, Witchfinder General. Now, obviously, this guy is a major influence on metal, I think. Just his idea, just his persona, just the legend of him, I think, inspired the entire genre, or at least most of the genre of doom metal. There is a band named after him, Witchfinder General. There's another band called Witchfind. Cathedral had a song about this particular character. Of course, there was a movie made, and we'll get into that later. So let's begin this podcast, this historical podcast on Here Lies Metal. Here we go. The year is 1645. A great darkness had descended upon England. Civil war, famine, and religious strife plague the island nation, and all of its great human suffering can be traced back to an ancient evil that has preyed on man's wicked desires.
Satan.
A secret society of the most wicked maidens, driven by greed, carnal desires, and their hatred of Jesus, has arisen to carry out Satan's evil deeds and unleash Satan's wrath upon the penitent, Puritan, God-fearing Christians of Essex, and ultimately the entire earth. These wicked minions live in the shadows. They might be your neighbors, the shopkeeper, the farmer, even your preacher, and possibly even your own family. They have rejected Christ our Lord and conspired with Satan, resulting in the suffering of war, famine, death that have all befallen God's children. It appears that the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse have arrived at our very gates, and our God has abandoned us. We pray for the Lord's salvation to deliver us from this scourge of Satan. God helps those who help themselves. So, who is ya gonna calleth? Matthew Hopkins, Witchfinder General, and his faithful sidekick, Jack Stern, at your service. The name Matthew Hopkins would go down in English history with sinister infamy. The Witchfinder General, a title bestowed upon himself, not unlike the band Manowar declaring themselves kings of metal in modern day, would be remembered for the reign of terror that he and his henchmen brought upon the county of Essex for a short but brutal 14-month period in the years 1645 to 1646. His brutal witch hunt plagued the land, already scarred by civil war and famine, resulting in an impressive pile of corpses 230 deep, achieving a body count with an efficiency that no witch hunts in the past 150 years could rival. It was this sinister merit that had immortalized the legend of Hopkins and his reign of terror that claimed the lives of so many innocents in that year. It might be difficult for some in modern day to enter a frame of reference to the events of 1645, but these were simple times. This was an age of puritanical fanaticism in society at large. Religion was the law. Evil was against the law and punishable by death. Satan was around every corner, and he was trying to tempt mankind to come to his aid against Jesus our Lord and Savior. You might now understand the market for such a man like Matthew Hopkins and his brutal methods to stomp out Satan before he tightened his grip on man, and unleashing the hordes from the fiery pits of hell to bring hell upon earth. This was an age of fear and paranoia, an age of ignorance and illiteracy. It would be easy to blame all of this death and misery of a civil war and crop failures, storms and shipwrecks, or any human tragedy on the devil. But since you couldn't see the devil, you would need to blame the next best thing. Those people in your village that everyone thought were weird. They must be in league with Satan, and therefore they are to blame for all of our misfortunes. I guess things haven't really changed much these days, have they? the result of a total lack of credible records. It was believed that Hopkins was born in Mistley, Essex in 1619 to James Hopkins and his wife Marie. James Hopkins was the vicar of Wenham in Suffolk. The reason we have any evidence of the existence and merits of Hopkins were the result of speculation by the existence of random records in the following years where his name came to be recorded. These records included the last will and testament of his father and local church burial records. Numerous records do in fact exist for his father James, primarily due to the fact of his position and as a well-respected clergyman. From these records, we do know that James Hopkins had 6 children. Matthew, possibly the youngest of the brothers who were naturally named after apostles of Christ. It is believed that Hopkins was brought up in a well-to-do family of devoutly religious convictions. As Matthew Hopkins grew older, there was little doubt the future fingerman and witch pricker had received some form of advanced education due to his level of influence and respect during his future reign of terror upon the county of Essex. It was more than likely that Hopkins was well versed in the Latin language and law, not to mention the complexities of witchcraft. However, no records of his official education exist. It was more than likely that he was homeschooled for the early stages of his own education. And there we have it, folks. Another victim of homeschooling gone great. That's what happens when you homeschool your kids, people. They turn out to be mass murderers. So it's important that you send your kids to school, because it's not about the quality of education. It's about social interactions as a child. You have your kid who hasn't met another child until he's like 12, right? Or until he gets to high school, or never, right? He's going to grow up to be a psycho killer. Kind of like Matthew Hopkins. There you go. Proof right here, people. You weird fucking homeschoolers. Get with the program. It was more than likely that Hopkins may have received a formal university education on the European continent, perhaps exciting his interest in witch hunting, as where such practices were in full effect upon the Low Countries. This might explain his lack of records in formal education in England. The earliest evidence of Hopkins' witch-finding practice occurred at a local tavern in Mistley named the Thorn Inn, which most likely was his place of residence, either as a landlord or a tenant. This very structure still stands today, but is not likely the original building from 1640 where Hopkins drafted his future plans as an icon of doom metal. It was at the Thorn Inn where Hopkins developed relationships with the local community elites in both church and state, some of which had ties to the highest level of Cromwell's Puritan government in London, validating his self-proclaimed title and authority as a government-appointed witch pricker. Witch pricker. Which pricker do you want me to use? Which pricker? Hardly know her. Everything was now in place for Hopkins' campaign of terror. A raging civil war, feeding a prevailing mood of uncertainty and fear, tension, and most of all, paranoia. This would be the perfect storm for Hopkins' scheme, and he would exploit this climate for his own financial benefit. It was in 1645 that Hopkins' reign of blood descended upon the land. His official knowledge of witchcraft and all things metal came from such popular titles of the day, such as Demonology by King James. Now, mind you, this was the original manual on witch hunting in England. King James was a Scottish king, and he was known as a philosopher king. Well, by self-proclaimed a philosopher king. However, he wrote the book Demonology to, in a way, you might say, update the original text of the Malleus Maleficarum, which was basically a book that said everyone is a witch, or everyone that isn't like you is a witch and they should be killed. Demonology was a book based on reason and logic, as King James considered himself a man well-schooled in law and reason. So it was this book that was supposed to actually improve witch hunting and kill less innocent people, perhaps. So This is something that Matthew Hopkins probably didn't really pay much attention to, as there have been times when King James, a known witch hunter himself and a witch prosecutor himself, would actually be reasonable enough to let certain people go instead of just killing everyone brought before him and declaring them a witch. There was a whole history of King James and his trials of supposed witches. This was a very popular thing at the time, being a witch, for the past 100 or so years surrounding this era in 1645. Witch hunting was just it was the fad, but only lasted like 100 years or so, and a lot of people died. So King James wrote the book on demonology, which Matthew Hopkins was inspired by to hunt witches. He thought he knew everything. He read some book and he thought he knew everything about witch hunting. Another book he read was The Wonderful Discovery of Witches in the County of Lancaster by Thomas Potts. Now, Hopkins was totally prepared for his new career in the booming industry of witch hunting. Naturally, he needed a target, and of course, the easier the target, the better. Such criteria to look for in an easy target would include someone publicly despised, ugly, lonesome, reclusive, preferably disabled, and most importantly, a freak. Hopkins, with his trusty sidekick, of which he made an acquaintance of at the Thorn Inn, Jack Stern, had just the victim to begin their murder spree. Elizabeth Clark was an easy target indeed. She was 80 years of age, considered absolutely ancient in the year 1645, where most people died around 30. In addition to her unnatural extent existent upon God's cruel earth, Clark had only one leg, and to add icing to Clark's despicable shit cake of an existence, her own mother was tried and executed for witchcraft decades earlier. Talk about having it bad. Did I mention she was an easy target? Oh, and obviously the townfolks of Mistley hated and feared this old fossil. Therefore, so few protested her accusations. Clark was apprehended and jailed on suspicion of witchcraft. She was then subject to enhanced interrogation, as then, like now, torture was illegal. Naturally, Clark had been encouraged to confess her crimes as a result of Hopkins' unique brand of humane methods of information extraction. He later wrote about his first victim in a pamphlet titled The Discovery of Witchcraft, and it went something like this. I'm going to do the Matthew Hopkins voice now, right? In March of 1644, he had some 7 or 8 of that horrible sect of witches living in the town where he lived, a town in Essex called Manningtree, with diverse and other adjacent witches of other towns, who, every 6 weeks in the night, being always on the Friday night, had their meeting close to his house, and had seen solemn sacrifices there offered to the devil. One whom this discoverer heard speaking to her imps, and bid them to go to another witch, who thereupon was apprehended. Together, with his loyal sidekick and boy wonder Jack Stern, they had subjected Clark to most humane methods of enhanced interrogation, such as stripping the accused naked, searching for any marks which would be identified as teats, where animal familiars and satanic imps would suckle their reward in blood from the witch. These teats were then poked and prodded, or pricked, hence the name witch pricker. Clark just so happened to have 3 of these demon receptacles on her body, in which Hopkins quotes, was found to have 3 teats about her, which no honest woman would have. Kept with no food nor drink for 3 nights, Clark naturally confessed to being in league with Satan, and revealed the names of 5 other women in her witch coven. She also confessed of her satanic animal familiars, in which Clark kept and nourished with her own blood. Names of these familiars were just too ridiculous to make up, and Hopkins himself agreed, as he claims names that no mortal can invent. Get this, these animals were called Holt, a white kitten. Oh, cute. Holt the white kitten. Jamara, a fat spaniel. Sack and Sugar, a black rabbit. News, a polecat. What's a polecat? And Vinegar Tom, a long-legged greyhound with a head like an ox, broad eyes and a long tail. What a strange-looking animal. No wonder why they thought it was satanic. During the eventual trial of Elizabeth Clark, who was charged with entertaining evil spirits, Hopkins gave this disposition in court. The said Elizabeth forthwith told informant and one Mr. Stern, they are present, if they would stay and do the said Elizabeth no hurt. She would call one of her white imps and play with it on her lap, but this informant told her they would not allow it. And they staying there while longer, the said Elizabeth confessed she had carnal copulation with the devil 6 or 7 years. And he would appear to her 3 or 4 times a week at her bedside, and go to bed with her and lie with her in half a night together. The shape of proper gentlemen, with laced band, having the whole proportion of a man, and he would say to her, Bessie, I must lie with thee. And she never did deny him. So she's doing it with the devil, and you know how Puritans feel about doing it with the devil. They don't like it. And they're going to have to put you on trial, and they're probably going to hang you or set you on fire now because you did it with the devil. No doing it with the devil. Following the resulting spike in local fear and paranoia, brought upon by the torture and incarceration of Elizabeth Clark, Hopkins and Stern didn't have a lot of trouble coercing the locals to give up even more names of people they were not fond of, essentially snowballing this sudden uptrend in witch mania among the terrified and illiterate populace. Expanding his operation, Hopkins and Stern expanded their ranks, assembling what appears to be a witch-finding dream team, including Mary Goody Phillips, whose speciality was finding witch marks on the bodies of those accused, while Edward Parsley and Francis Mild made up the rest of the team. We're not sure what they did. Maybe they just carried the gear around. They did some roadies. So he had a couple of guys with him. From this point on, Hopkins would exclaim, Witch pickers assembled! Upon the sight of the bright beacon flashed in the sky whenever local witch activity was reported by the helpless authorities. This was a job for Matthew Hopkins, Witchfinder General, and his furious band of witch pickers. Upon the merry band of witch pickers' ongoing crusade to vanquish all forms of Satan from the countryside, over 100 more people would be named, all of who would confess rather promptly, ever increasing the snowball effect of suspects at an exponential rate. At this point, in his brief but effective, not to mention lucrative career of witch hunting, Hopkins and friends were riding high on their recent merits. Hopkins would openly advertise his services under the title Witchfinder General, and that he and his Justice League were by special commission from Parliament to rid the country of evil witches once and for all. Capitalizing on a fanatical society of Puritans, and you know how Puritans get. I mean, is it really any different today? We have psychotically religious people all over the world that are really just as irrational as they were in 1645. Has anything really changed? There are people just as ridiculous. And I'm sure in some places you can be burnt as a witch. And that's right here in America. Has it changed much? I'm not sure. We have some pretty crazy people who invest their entire lives in the belief of a fairy tale. We have to move on as mankind. That's my little editorial for this. Combined with the fear and uncertainty of a society in turmoil and in the throes of civil war, Hopkins was naturally a busy man. By now, it was no secret that Hopkins was not hunting witches for a reason of devout faith and hatred of the devil, or as a steadfast defender of order and virtue, upholding Puritan Christian values and combating Satan wherever he might appear, to save mankind from certain doom of hellfire. This shrewd and entrepreneurial Hopkins, driven by the Anglo-Saxon Christian work ethic, those really annoying waspy people that you can't stand, was doing this for profit. Killing was his business, and business was good, one might say. More of a con man than a virtuous knight in shining armor, sent by God to deliver man from the ravages of Satan. Hopkins' racket was to collect local gossip, likely at his residence, the Thorn Inn, twist and embellish these tales into official accusations, apprehensions, interrogations, confessions, show trials, guilty verdicts, and ultimately executions, where Hopkins would conveniently receive a quid bonus each time a witch went to the gallows. Not bad. As Hopkins' witch-finding service became more prominent, new and colorful methods of enhanced interrogation were devised. Methods that might elevate public engagement, therefore acting as entertainment for mostly illiterate peasantry and ultimately promoting his booming trade of witch-finding. This new public spectacle was known as swimming, and it went something like this. The accused would be bound and thrown into a body of water, and you might have guessed how the results were determined. If you floated, and most humans do, but I, Maledictus, by the way, do not float, because I am so metal, I sink. I am incapable of floating, so I might have been set free as a non-witch. Imagine that. Anyway, if you floated, you were obviously a witch. And if you sank, like I would, you were innocent. But you also died. Well, at least I would be spared a pricking session. No pricking for Maledictus. Swimming wasn't actually a method invented by Hopkins. However, Hopkins did formulate a method to make it more torturous, unpleasant, and painful by tightly binding the accused into an uncomfortable, contorted position as they were lowered into the water. I told you, Hopkins was pretty damn metal. As the bodies piled up and Hopkins' bank account swelled, Hopkins Christ Superstar felt unstoppable. He and his merry band of witchfinders were still gleaming in the fame received from their successful Chelmsford trials, where nearly 30 suspected witches were executed. However, it was Hopkins' next victim that would push his witch-pricking party over the edge and ultimately bring on the downfall and demise of Hopkins in his reign of terror. His name was John Lowe, and he was the minister of Brandonson. That's right, this guy was a man of the cloth. However, the 7-year-old pastor was not necessarily well revered by his own congregation. In fact, they deemed him as a carmunculous old fossil, and they wanted him gone. And what better way to make your enemies disappear than to summon Essex's premier paranormal investigator, witchfinder, witchpricker, and torturer? Advanced interrogator. Who is you gonna calleth? Upon his arrest and interrogations, where the frail old preacher was subject to sleep deprivation, where the accused would be run in circles backwards and forwards about his cell until exhaustion. This method of interrogation would be repeated for days on end until the accused would confess, and confess did he. It went a little something like this. He had covenanted with the devil, suckled familiars, we have some more names, Tom, Flo, Bess, and Mary, for 5 years, and had bewitched cattle, whatever that involved. What does it involve? How do you bewitch cattle? Are the cattle in the Candlemas video where Messiah Marklin's like, "You are bewitched," and the cattle's like, "Moo?" Maybe that's how you do it. But anyway, that's what this guy was doing. He was pointing at cows, and he was going, "You are bewitched." He had also caused a ship to sink off Harwich on calm sea with the loss of 14 lives. Imagine that shit. They thought this guy caused a shipwreck. Unbelievable. A later pamphlet by Stern states that Lowe was joyful to see what power his imps had. Lowe later retracted his confession, but this didn't save him. And since he was not allowed a clergyman to read the burial service for him, he recited it himself on his way to the scaffold on the 27th of August, 1645. So he had to read his own death sermon as he was hanged. Very nice. Most likely the result of desperate ravings of a tortured and exhausted 70-year-old, none of which was even remotely factual. This statement was taken as evidence, despite the fact there existing no evidence of such a shipwreck even. He basically just said, yeah, this ship sunk and 14 people died. He did it. He bewitched some cattle and the fucking ship sank. I totally did. And they were like, all right, I guess you're right then. The ship sank. Hang him. With over 200 suspects incarcerated and awaiting trial and being subjected to horrific treatment, including an actual ordained minister, it wasn't long before the actual people in charge in London began to take notice. Local authorities began to question Hopkins' claim of appointment by Parliament, in an appointment in which he likely completely fabricated. I am Witchfinder General. Yes, that's what it says here. I was appointed by the people in London. I am the king of metal, damn it. I am the king of witch-finding. That's me. Totally. That's basically what he did. And they were like, Witchfinder? What? We don't have such a title. There's no such title. This guy just fucking made this shit up. Foreseeing his eventual demise at the hands of the increasingly victorious pro-royalist rebels, Hopkins had doubled his efforts to expedite as many executions before his scam was revealed. So basically there was a civil war going on. It was the royalists versus the non-royalists. And I know you think royalists are annoying, but the non-royalists were these Puritans, and they were really fucking annoying. So those are the same people that basically were kicked out of England, and they came here and they formed America. Now you know why things are the way they are. That's why there's no fucking bare boobs on TV, because Puritans, people, they still have an influence in this country. They're still out there. They're still running things. Maybe they'll all die one day. Anyway, let's continue. It was at this stage, the very height of Hopkins' influence and fame, where it would all come crashing down as suddenly as it began. It wasn't too long before local authorities began to question his brutal methods and speak out against his exploits, quickly turning the fearful mob against Hopkins and his followers. By 1646, the hunter now became the hunted. The pricker now became the pricked. Hopkins had pushed it too far. He had pricked too much. His greed and brutality had eventually backfired, and he had no choice but to disband his merry men and retreat back to his hometown in Mistley. He ran home to Mommy. He was like, oh shit, my scheme is uncovered. I better get the fuck out of here. So he took off his little hat and got into civilian clothes and ran home back to the Thorn Inn and just had a beer. He was like, oh, well, me? I'm not Matthew. I'm just some guy here drinking a beer. I'm just some guy drinking a beer here at the inn. I'm just drinking a pint then. I'm witch hunting. I don't know about witch pricking. I've just been here all along. He ran away. He disappeared. The reign of terror unleashed by the ruthless yet entrepreneurial witchfinder Matthew Hopkins only 14 months prior, in which over 230 suspected witches, mostly women, were brutally tortured and executed, not to mention the hundreds of more that were wrongfully imprisoned, had vanished overnight, like it never happened. In conclusion, the actual fate of Hopkins following his downfall remains a mystery. One account states that, in a miraculous and vindicating case of poetic justice, Hopkins was himself accused of witchcraft while passing through Suffolk. He was allegedly charged with having stolen a book listing all of the witches in England and obtained such a tome by the means of sorcery. And you know how we feel about sorcery here in Puritan land. Sorcery means we burn you. He was then summarily set upon by an angry mob, not unlike the very angry mobs that he and his cohorts used to ignite. He was then subject to his own unique interrogation method of swimming. Ain't payback a bitch, Matty? Some accounts state that Hopkins did not float, like Maledictus, and he drowned, while others claim that he did float and was condemned to hang. Wouldn't that be a bitch if this is what happened to him? He's running home. He's like, I'm not a witch finder. Like, look, a witch. She's like, me? No, I'm not a witch. No, it's not me then. And they just put him on, they dumped him in the water. He's like, no, I don't float. No, it's not me. And then, by the end of the day, he's hanged. That's what happens. Shit happens, Matthew Hopkins. However, no more records of Hopkins appear to exist following 1647, likely confirming his death that same year. A more boring and likely cause of death was most likely revealed by his surviving faithful sidekick Jack Stern, who claimed, in his own account of events, a confirmation and discovery of witchcraft, in which Stern simply added confirmation to the same title that Hopkins had used previously. So he just took Hopkins' book and said, this is a confirmation of that book, and it's written by me, Jack Stern. Everyone like me now. Everyone hit the like button. It's a confirmation of the discovery of witchcraft. That was what people used to do back then. That's how people just stole each other's posts back then. That's basically what he did. Either way, Stern had stated that Hopkins had passed away peacefully after a long sickness of consumption. A likely cause of death, as most old-timey people seemed to die of consumption by the age of 30 back in those days. He died of consumption. It says on those old gravestones, it says, died of consumption. What is consumption anyway? I think it's tuberculosis. Either way, he died pretty young. He was probably in his 30s when he died. He didn't last long. A loose record of his burial was identified and simply reads, Matthew Hopkins, son of Mr. James Hopkins, minister of Wenham, was buried at Mistley, August 12, 1647. However, it is not known where Hopkins' remains actually lie. Despite a brief 14-month of fame and notoriety, there is no doubt that Hopkins left behind an immortal legacy, still celebrated today, especially in the world of doom metal, which we'll do an episode on. We're going to do an episode on doom metal soon, people. I know you'll want the episode on doom metal. We're going to do doom metal. With such bands as new wave British heavy metal doom bands like Witchfinder General and Witchfind, the dark and brutal era and culture of the witch hunt would inspire numerous doom metal bands nearly 400 years into the future. This would also be there would also be a title of a song by Cathedral in their Forest of Equilibrium. I believe it's the Forest of Equilibrium album called Matthew Hopkins Witchfinder General, where they had taken excerpts and sound bits from the movie we're about to talk about. And you all know the Legend of Matthew Hopkins would also inspire this particular B-grade torture exploitation film in 1968 titled The Conqueror Worm, after a poem by Edgar Allan Poe. This film, featuring the legendary horror icon Vincent Price, who would portray the anti-hero Matthew Hopkins, appeared to be marginally accurate based on the accounts of Hopkins' real-life exploits that we just read. I mean, for the most part, there was a lot of embellished things, but you could identify some characters in the movie that occurred in the story we just wrote. Of course, they made it a little more, interesting. They put a love triangle in there, a couple of things like that. But anyway, this is essentially a torture porn movie, as they call it, where Price portrays Hopkins as a crooked and corrupt sexual deviant, well versed in the art of hypocrisy. Hopkins eventually finds justice at the movie's end, where he and his sidekick Stern are summarily and brutally butchered by a vengeful soldier who filled the obligatory role as the handsome and righteous leading man in the film. I forget who it was. I guess they figured that quietly dying of consumption was a bit too boring for the end of this film. Anyway, that's the story of Matthew Hopkins, Witchfinder General. Now, what is the moral of this story? Moral of this story is if you bullshit people, you will eventually get caught and you will be dunked and hanged. So, it's about honesty. It's about taking advantage of your power. And it's about being a Puritan. Don't be a fucking Puritan, people. There are no witches. There are no witches. There are just some goths out there that pretend they're witches. And they're pretty silly, and they don't deserve to be burnt, okay? They're silly people. They want to be witches. They want to pretend they're witches. There is no reason to burn them. And I'm talking to everyone. I'm talking either you don't like witches or you're a religious fanatic. No one deserves to be burnt these days. Unless you're into, like, gent music or something, maybe you should be set on fire. That is the moral of the story, people. Do not find witches. Do not kill innocent people. Do not set them on fire for being different. And that's what this is all about. These people were different. They looked different. They were the uncool people in society. That's who the witches were. It wasn't like the hot people. It wasn't the good-looking people. It wasn't the rich people. They were not accused of being witches. It was the poor, weird people that were missing legs that were accused of being witches, and they were set on fire. Today, it would be the metalheads. It'd be you and me. They'd be burning us. Of course, I wouldn't float, so I might have a way out, if I didn't drown. I'd be like, well, he's not a witch, is he? He looks like a damn witch, but, he listens to all kind of that metal music. He's into some really fucked up music. Plays some really loud guitar. He must be a witch, but then I wouldn't float. So they're like, what the fuck is wrong with this guy? How can he not float? I just don't float, people.